All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Juniper or Brandy J. Lewis. I am one of the panelists here for our talk entitled Furry Coming on 40, a trans queer furry conversation. I first want to thank the audience who are a part of this today, academics, furries, furry adjacent folks, artists, and I want to thank my panelists, Hazel, Robyn, and Willow Glopossum here for being a part of this talk. Today we'll be discussing furry and its current contemporary kind of place in time, but also we're coming up on 40 years of furry being a fandom. Whether you date furry starting off in the fanzines and amateur press associations of Voodoo and Rowrbrazzle, or you dated right around the room parties and furry being taken up as a term of endearment and identity. And so we'll be discussing several questions as a panel, going over our thoughts, our opinions, and then towards the end, we'll save time for questions and answers. And so try to hold any questions you might have towards the end, and we'll start having them posted in the chat. But I first want to give a chance for our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's go ahead and start with Hazel, and then we could go to Robyn and Willow.
What should I include? My name, anything in particular,
Yeah,
or
your name, your time in the fandom, anything you feel would be valuable.
yeah, sure. Hazel, she, her. Been a furry off and off since I was like 12 or 13, I feel like. And I'm a assistant professor of social work, and yeah, I think that sums about it, sums it up.
All right, and then I'm going to pass it to you, Robyn.
Hi, I'm Robyn. I use she, her pronouns. I've been a furry since probably like 2012, and I'm a cartoonist.
Yeah, and to add, Robyn, you can be found online under the username TaciturnDeer
Yes,
most often.
that's correct.
Thank
TaciturnDeer on everything.
thank you. And then Willow.
Yeah. Hi. I'm Willow. I make art and comics under the name Glopossum online, and I have been a furry, I'm realizing now, for coming up on 20 years, and I'm very happy to be here.
Now, going into our first question, which just kind of builds off what we're already doing. Um, when you started furry, or as you've been going through it, how did you understand furry? What has furry been to you over your time? This is trying to get an idea of positionality, where you see furry, where you play within it, but also to think about, like, how do you engage furry as this thing if you had to describe it to others who maybe are not fans. And anyone could start off however they want to go. Can I maybe toss
Yeah,
it
it's just you
to
should pick someone.
all right, let's go to you, Hazel, first.
No, I knew it. I knew it.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah. So, um, how do you get into furry? Like, how do you see it? Where do you play within the space of furry, or how do you understand it?
I guess I understand it. I feel like over time, my understanding of it, my personal connection to it, I think over time has like changed, I feel like. But right now, I feel like I connect to it in different ways. There's like so many different like not sections or communities within, but like I feel like I'm in various furry spaces and that kind of connect like different plugs everywhere, if that makes sense. But I don't know, furry to me feels very much like a play space. And it's always been that to me in some way, in different ways. And I feel like play spaces and various play spaces, like if I'm feeling like I want to play in this particular way or that particular way, there's different ways I can play with it within this giant thing that I've always referred to or always have known as furry, if that makes sense. So I think throughout time I've connected to it in just different ways for my own individual use and desires.
Yeah, and then Robyn, can I ask you, how did you get into furry, and kind of where do you see yourself in the midst of this
Yeah,
community?
I feel like for me, it's always been kind of like an aesthetics and like signifier. So I think we all kind of fall under like a similar umbrella of, the types of aesthetics that we're engaging with, whether that be through like art, music, personal expression. And that's just how I've always kind of visualized it. You can like, branch that into different things, just like depending on what you want to do with it personally. So I've always thought it was kind of an open-ended thing.
Yeah, and would you say, like, particularly like with your comic and artwork, you
Mhm.
find it's this way of expressing kind of the, like, I think what's beautiful about your work is those smaller moments that you tend
Mhm.
to render that,
Yeah.
are impactful even though we look over them. Do you find that furry is helpful in kind of
Yes.
rendering life in certain ways?
Yeah.
And what about you, Willow? When did you get into furry, and kind of where have you found yourself maybe stabilize with the community?
I mean, I found it in like the early 2000s and found it through art. And so my first sort of viewpoint or perspective on it was as like a community of artists, or like you mentioned, sort of an aesthetic signifier, but in a way more like, I guess, an artistic movement online. And um, as I've kind of like grown to become more a part of it, and then it's been more immersed into every aspect of my life, felt like it's gone beyond just like a fandom or community, and it's now this like entire subculture that has all these different um pockets of just like expression within it.
Do any of you feel as though furry has become a large part of your life?
All of
Uh,
it.
Mhm.
all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
pretty
so
much.
so to join in kind of this conversation, I was raised in like the southeast corner of Los Angeles, and I was raised by my grandparents who they didn't have a lot of money. We would, if we went to the bookstore, it was more so look rather than purchase. And I really got into like Sonic the Hedgehog action figures. I would watch cartoons like Mummy's Alive, Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic Underground, and on the playground draw myself and my friends with each other as characters from Sonic or different shows. And when I found out about furry, it was like, oh, like this is a playful way of like depicting myself otherwise. Like, whether it was like the elemental wolves on DeviantArt or like sparkle dogs or however many forms of early furry there was for me. I found it was this way to play, even though I was being told you have to grow up. Like, and one of my friends on Twitter said, my character Coco, which is a brown dog with a red balloon, kept her whimsy. And I really feel that furry has helped me keep my whimsy throughout all these struggling times and growing into adulthood when we are told to grow up. I don't know, does that resonate with anyone?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Mhm.
I think a lot of the work about from, if you know Tommy Bruce or Addie Boy, where I think we're all familiar with him, I hope, but um he delves into a lot about how furry serves as a method of like really healthy escapism in kind of a time of the world and country when that's like extremely needed. And I guess escapism has some negative connotations, but I think that's kind of like a very necessary thing in this day and age to maintain balance.
Yeah, and Robyn, I saw you shaking your head or nodding. Could you maybe speak on it as well?
Yeah, like I kind of agree with the escapism viewpoint. Honestly, I kind of want to toss it back to like what Hazel was saying about
Yeah.
it being play. Like I
Yeah,
know in like a lot of the artist circles that I write in, like we've all like tried to describe, the work that we're doing as play, you know. So yeah, definitely resonate with that heavily.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then pull back to Hazel.
Oh yeah, no, I don't know, I just think play is so important, and I mean play is so important generally, but I think for so many of us, I mean speaking from my own experience, like I had, growing up quickly or like not really feeling like I could play, I feel like furry has allowed me to play in so many different ways. I didn't really come into furry as an artist. I came more into furry as just as somebody who wanted to play, if that makes sense, because it felt like something that I mean, I lived a very compartmental life where like it was almost a secret, like being a furry, where it was at least in the early 2000s, late 90s, like thinking about my deep fandom into like Digimon and Sonic and like Star Fox and like these things, and then slowly into these like online forums and IRC chats about them, and it was all just play. It was all just like playing with each other in ways that I think like I couldn't experience anywhere else, and it felt like survival too. Like it just felt like this is play that I couldn't just do with anybody. It felt like which made it feel like secret. I mean, it was play that was queer and it was play that was like self-discovery, but it was also play that I think was like giving life to me and people around me too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and what's interesting, so coming at it from like an archival sense, if you look at a lot of the early furry documents, whether that's the fanzines, the amateur press associations, or the comics like Critters, where artists were like publishing their works and then getting fan feedback, a lot of what early fans and artists gravitated towards was the sense of play in community. And so, Voodoo was this chance for professional artists and underground artists to play and experiment with a form that for so long had been argued for children or was a form of caricature. And then when you get to Rowrbrazzle by Marc Schirmeister, Fred Patton, and other editors, you see people coming up with characters, people coming up with storylines, people coming up with questions like, what would happen if like Daisy Duck decided to like date Mickey Mouse instead? How would that go in terms of like Disney's like unsaid rules? And this playfulness, I think, really has stood the time with furry, that even now, it comes up in different ways where people are always questioning like, what is play versus community? How far is too much play? And where is the line that like exceeds play and goes to like, oh, these characters are bad, or these characters are too silly and weird. Any of you found yourself like struggling with that question of play, particularly from queer trans perspectives? Like for me, I think that playfulness of furry allows me to identify and represent myself in ways that I can't in normative society, let's say, for instance.
Hmm.
I mean, it
I
goes
th
back to what, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, you first.
I was gonna really link to what Willow was saying about like Tommy Bruce's work or, at his work and thinking about like, it is like a form of escapism, this play. I feel like they kind of go like hand in hand, but at the same time, it's like the spaces feel like, lack of a better word, like, yeah, like secretive play or like play with things that like feel inappropriate, like if that makes sense. And so I think like, because it is queer, because it is like seen as like, not making sense, but like odd or unusual is that like that's why it's secret or escapist, but also it's also why it gives life, I think, in so many different ways. I think I felt bad, but also felt good at the same time when participating in furry things when I was younger, if that makes sense. So kind of in between there. But sorry, Willow, go. I just rambled.
No, I was also gonna just think about like it in terms of like I think any good thing enjoyed in complete excess can actually become a vice or hindering to your sort of perception of the world or how you participate in the world around you. And so one of the things I'm very grateful for being, more of a full-time furry and existing very in a very rich like furry community in the Pacific Northwest is that my sense of escapism has dwindled because now like my day-to-day life and my like community that I can offer support to and like actually like participate within and like give back to is just no longer escapism but just a part of the world. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I guess that's to say just like I value keeping some sort of level or of groundedness within it as well.
Yeah. Did you want to jump in on that, Robyn? Like this question of play and like escape?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I think, it depends for everybody, just like the community that you're around, digitally, physically. And I think utilizing, furry as like a conduit for play can be you know, yeah, in excess, or you can do it like minimally. I think for a lot of people, especially like in Philadelphia, there's like a ton of like transsexual furry artists. Like I was talking to my friend Yaster the other day, and like I've been very inspired by her work because she, in all of her zines, like takes all these like taboo subjects and kind of pushes the bounds in a way that you couldn't necessarily do with human characters, and like utilizes like the animal form to just like really drive a point home. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think about the way in which you all, because you all are artists, you all sketch, draw, design in ways that I'm mostly into writing. I feel as though, like, while on the one hand we could argue art in the furry fandom is a superpower, it also is this way in which that play and escape gets melded with the real in certain ways. You get to depict your lives yourselves in playful manners, so to speak, but also there was a point brought up in the chat, just using the term play when describing furry seemed reductive of what it can or could be. And I think, kind of in an Audre Lorde thinking of pleasure
Mm.
kind of way, play can be this way of sustaining ourselves, of kind of keeping us seeing things from different angles, but also, recognizing you are a human that needs to kind of like care for the self in certain ways. And that's where furry as this kind of open space really allows for that. Whereas, like, let's say for even in video game culture or something, you still have like a game you're playing and there's certain expectations, whereas furry, it could be anything, right?
Yeah.
Now, knowing that
Hmm.
furry is around 40 years of coming into like discussion, um within recent years, just being a fan, what are some things maybe that you really find exciting about furry, that whether it's new, whether it's old and it's continued? For me, I love watching more and more younger fans get into the community and dress up in suit, start drawing, getting good feedback, and learning about their community in ways that are new, filled with nuance. But what about you all? So let's say, for instance, Willow, do you have anything that excites you on furry, whether older or newer in the community?
Yeah, I think as sort of this fandom seems to be expanding exponentially, especially with like how accessible it is and how easy the like ticket of entry is to it, which is just kind of self-defining of like, oh yeah, I want to become this. You see, I think this wider range of expression from all sorts of different identities across the world, across gender, and as well as that, just seeing that it's becoming this increasingly more queer friendly, queer forward, progressive space that's really important today, especially. But just seeing, I think, a uh, widening range of perspectives, expressions within artists has been really exciting over the last couple of years. And also just like seeing what we can do with this very basic concept of like, okay, let's take the anthropomorphized animal, like what can we do with that? And now it's stretching into like, there's like, I see gallery shows, I see art that is just like, honestly, like maybe even over my head or like too smart for its own good, like really great work out there that is still like self-defined and I guess more objectively defined as furry. Yeah.
I'm gonna jump here to Robyn. Do you have any thoughts?
yeah, I've been really excited about kind of the like resurgence of a lot of DIY furry spaces. Like you're saying, like galleries, like underground shows, things like that. I feel like we're creating a lot more community spaces that can exist like outside of cons and in local communities. And I think that like helps people, be brought together in a more physical sense. And it's great for things like mutual aid and just like, having personal connections. Um, and that's something that I really want to see continue into the future.
Yeah, and it's funny because when you look at older furry, quote unquote, you do see how a lot of the fandom started with this DIY space and culture that, while it was focused on comics in many ways and science fiction, it became this otherwise space where online, queer folks created this like furry muck space to like imagine their communities and relationships in ways that were important to them. And so it's telling, or affecting to like see some of this come back, but in different forms, in different ways, that people do want to say like, well, that's not furry or fandom, but again, it's like, what is furry, what is fandom, and how can we play with those terms?
Right.
Hazel, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, echoing what everyone says, I think, or just like at least particular that comes up to me is like that kind of like DIY or more like, I don't know, like analog kind of vibe. Like, I mean, like I even have like some of like Bunny Mutt's like Patreon like letters that I get sent like physically, and like I feel like it's very interesting to see like these kind of things really come back, and I come back, but like I feel like this kind of, I don't know, I got it, and I was like, this is so like I love this physical part of it, but also like not opposite or adding this binary, but I also love like this like surges of like VR chat. Like VR chat's been so like cool, and like I was kind of brought into it into furry again through VR chat, and it's like super excited about what virtual reality can do and what it has done for the furry community, especially like during COVID or did times where people cannot connect physically. So, and also music, like thinking about like the furry screamo scene, the furry metalcore scene, like different ways that furries can engage with the fandom. It's not just through like the visual, but through like these music scenes that almost like subverts what furry, pushes, I think, against like the boundaries of furry even more and more as it's always kind of growing and becoming something. I just like how people are interacting with it in just like any way possible. And it feels like furry's never pushing back, if that makes sense. So I think I look forward to just seeing, every time I go to a con, I'm just like blown away by what people are pushing constantly.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
I know, Willow, you do music.
Hmm.
And I know, one of the big points that I always like to make with folks is like Magic Records. Like we are starting like this own like music playoff from furry, where you know fandom has always had this like play space with music where people would write silly songs about Star Trek. Or I remember one of my first Califer conventions, there was a guy who would dress up like a pirate and sing sea shanties about cats and kitties. But that same space gives birth to all these other like repertoires of performance that on the one hand people play down because, oh, it's just fandom, oh, it's just fanishness. But on the other hand, it's like, no, like people can make a living and do these things outside of an industry that wants to openly consume them, right? And turn their product into commodities that separate the artist from the product itself. um I know we're kind of jumping around here a little bit,
Hmm.
but kind of coming back to this question of furry around 40 years, what does it mean to you as an individual, as an artist, as a fan, that furry has been around 40, maybe even like kind of bleeding into 50 years? Does that like inspire you in ways, or does that make you kind of rethink what you do in light of what maybe something that might have happened in the past?
It makes me feel old. I feel like if that makes sense. Like I was like thinking about like, oh cool, 40 years. And then I was like, I'm like 36. I'm like almost as old as it's like weird to think about almost. Like it's been around my whole life in a way. I maybe haven't engaged with it during its existence, but I don't know, it's just it's an interesting phenomenon to like think about and like how I engage with it, but also like what it means. I don't know. I had no real answer to that.
Yeah.
Feel like it makes me feel hopeful,
Uh-huh.
honestly.
Yeah.
Like I see, these like older queer people who have like gone through so much and these artists who have like, experienced so many like different historical events and like especially now, with everything that's going on, you know, if they could come together as a community, push through that, let their voices be heard, be leaders. I think that like inspires confidence in me now. I think a lot of people feel that.
Yeah, Willow.
Um, Sorry, someone messaged me on Telegram and it killed my train of thought. That's the problem with being on my computer. Can you reiterate the question for me?
Yeah, so what does it feel like coming into this knowledge of furry at about or around 40 years?
Oh yeah, okay. Circling back, it gives me a pretty immense sense of like pride and belonging, especially just knowing that the community, this term, this culture, whatever you want to call it, has this sense of like strength and longevity
Mhm.
as it continues to age and grow. And it has this almost like, I guess, sort of predefined sense of like what you can do to contribute and belong to it. And that it doesn't ask for much in return, but it can give you a lot. And just, I don't know, being a part of that is like kind of beautiful to me. And I love to see it continue.
Yeah, I lean into to what you said, Robyn and Willow. Like at the one hand, it's hopeful and inspiring. On the other hand, it's this kind of like what practices it leads to more questions like what practices have continued, in what ways do we keep up kind of what was first started. And so one of the first times that I got a chance to work in the archives at UC Riverside and see like documents from the 1970s, 60s, and 1980s, one of the archivists said like, oh, just letting you know, if you have questions about the collection and the furry stuff, the undergrads will have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, oh, well, that's understandable. And they were like, no, like we showed them some of the stuff because they didn't know what furry was. And they just gasped at like all the things that were there, both adult and non-adult, and weren't sure how to reconcile like with the material. And you know, there was that humorous part like, oh my God, what did you show them? Like, was it this like artwork that, you know, has been hidden away or not talked about for so long? But it was also like that question of how is furry different from like mundane fandom, you know, like Marvel, DC, these structurally capitalistic forms or structures, whereas furry, you know, tries to hold on to as much as it can its independent do-it-yourself nature. I know within the last few years, there were incidences at Anthrocon where resellers would come in and fans, you know, standing their ground saying, we do not abide by this because this is somebody else's product coming in and taking space away from somebody trying to make a living, trying to practice community versus trying to make a buck and play off of what's already there, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you all feel at some point maybe that furry still struggles in some way at 40 years with its kind of independent nature?
Hmm.
What do you mean exactly? Or I'm trying to think of
Yeah.
like,
I guess I have a unique perspective as somebody who is like my entire livelihood is supported by the fandom, and
Mm-hmm.
that I'm feeling this sense of like, oh no, it like this works, especially the size of it all, the fandom that like in a way, like if we think about it as like an economy of supporting independent artists like that, that it's functional and it works, and that like the need to reach out to a corporate entity like that isn't really necessary in terms of like, oh, the furry fandom needs the support or it needs these optics. It's like that is done, I think, for that innate sense of like trying to, I guess, sanitize sanitize an image to make it like friendlier. But I don't know what the impulse behind that is because thankfully can't understand it.
Yeah, Hazel, Robyn, do either of you feel that, you know, even within the fandom, we as fans or artists or community figures kind of like find limits to the independence or like find ourselves struggling against the outside world because of our independent nature?
I don't
uh,
necessarily think it's, a bad thing. Um, I think like just objectively a lot of like furry like art and media is just like kind of strange. And, I think everybody is like entitled to do what they want to with their work, and like whether you want to just like hand out zines for free or like sell your stuff in a bookstore. I think that that's cool. Um, I think like convention spaces definitely struggle with that a lot. I feel like every year I go to cons and I see more and more just like giant pop-ups and things like that that just feel a bit disingenuous. And I feel like that kind of conflicts with that like DIY independent nature. And I feel like that's where kind of a fissure can happen in community.
Yeah. I feel like we're struggling with that like right now, if that makes sense. And I feel like this comments in the chat kind of like hit on that a lot too. Like I was just thinking about them as we're talking. Like I don't know if like it's I don't think furry could ever be fully corporate, but I don't think because I think there's no desire to want what exactly furry is, if that makes sense. But there's definitely a desire. Like I feel like I see that more less in the con space and more in like TikTok, like these social media spaces, where I see like not like your brands like selling furry, but more of like the algorithm and like these, figures or these kind of like productions creating a furry aesthetic that is potentially disingenuous, but is like trying to engage an audience, if that makes sense. Like it's interesting to see how corporate or these more like larger dominant figures in our media are like trying to figure out how they can gain our attention, if that makes sense. While at the same time, like I don't know why they would want to. At the same, it doesn't make sense because I feel like furry is so you can't really like in this comment like neuter it, if that makes sense, or sanitize it. But at the same time, they're figuring out how to produce it in a way that, I don't know. I think right now as I'm trying to figure like what does this mean currently? Like I see it the most online and like on these spaces. So I don't know. And like, there's conversations about a particular figure too that we're in conversation with, I feel like all the time right now. So it's just interesting to see what furry is, you know, in neoliberal capitalist society, how we're figuring that out.
Yeah, so John Fisk wrote in like the 1990s how fandom has its kind of shadow economy underneath like capitalism. And if you look at the history of fanzines, um, fanzines developed in some ways from early capitalists like here, turn of the 20th century, have your home version of a printing press, allowing children to print and enthusiasts to print their own magazines and newspapers as newspapers were really taking off in industrial spaces. And so capitalism has always had this kind of bleed into fandom and around fandom. But I think, particularly right now with furry, there's that way in which, as an independent space, you almost have to, because of neoliberal society, you're pushed to compete against each other rather than produce in collectivity and community. And I see this a lot with streaming, with TikTok and social media, where on YouTube in particular, you'll see videos of like, how did this convention go bad? And how did this, like, because of one person? And call outs in some cases are right, but also like, how is that in some ways preventing work of community forming taking shape? How does that prevent these conversations from happening when it's like, we just need to rein our grandpa or uncle in, versus like just create content that neoliberalizes fandom more than maybe we might want. And so I know with in terms of artists, it's that question of like, who is pricing their art at what price? Is that good enough? Is that too much? And I think at Anthrocon this last year, there was even that question, like, how much is too much to price art within furry to make it affordable to others?
Hmm.
Kind of going back, do you feel like within kind of where we're at with furry, there are things like that kind of do affect this question of community and fandom and collectivity? Are there struggles that we're still trying to figure out and like make sense of, whether tied to capitalism or not?
Yeah, I feel like, there's the meme about two cakes that I see often, and that does still ring true about how people frame it as being in competition with each other, or even that like the influence of artistic style can be seen as like, oh, you're biting my style and now it's a competition, when really it's just um but something I was thinking a lot about while you were talking was the effect of capitalism upon like how it affects the art that you produce innately, and that it has, with the reduction of art being now content or a product, it's like you've changed the gear you're shifted in when you're creating. Instead of self-expression, you're trying to go for marketability, and I think that
Right.
hinders a lot of artists and actually kind of kneecaps their artistic progression, I think. And maybe that is sort of a more, I guess, conceptual, hypothetical guess at like what that effect could be, that like the actual art being produced, like the intent is kind of wrong or skewed by capitalism, and that it should just be, maybe you make something that um, could theoretically be produced into a physical product, and then you can like get some support from that. But otherwise, I feel like there's too much um, maybe physical commodification of art, but maybe that's, I don't know.
No,
I,
I kind
that
of,
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely like kind of resonate with that, where it's like, there's the one hand where like it's really nice to have, physical stuff that people are making, especially like from an archival perspective, and just being like, we have all of this, physical history that we can go back through and look at. But like I definitely like feel like there's a ton of people who just kind of come through and it's like, a commodity, as opposed to people who are, engaging with the art. And, that puts you in that perspective, like as an artist, where you're just making things to be purchased rather than making things to really be engaged with.
Which I would debate, like some spaces prioritize. Like I feel like sometimes
Mhm.
con spaces prioritize those who do like make things as a product, if that makes sense. And thinking
Mhm.
about, I'm particularly thinking about like musicians and DJs who do not
Mhm.
get paid or who do not get like a certain kind of funding, but other artists DJs do. And thinking about, you know, just like who gets what and like what is being produced and not produced and who is being prioritized is, I think, whether we like it or not, a capitalistic mindset within the furry community that I
Yeah.
think is like how it bleeds into our spaces for sure.
Yeah, and to jump in on that, like I'm always thinking about how do we see echoes or resonances of the past within the present as well as like the future in the present. And there's that discussion of what early fur cons were, were they spaces where people just got together and drew for each other, where people can have chats, people can buy art, and that question of consumerism and community has always existed since then, with comic cons developing into these larger economic spaces, but furry still being that space where it's like, okay, I can be weird here, or I can kind of go sideways from normative mundane conventions. And I think one of the struggles that I've witnessed, and it's interesting but also like scary for me as someone who's more on the consumption side, is watching artists struggle to get into conventions more and more, and for some to be like, this is like my 13th con not being able to get into a dealer's den or artist alley. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And that really deflates and kind of ruins that sense of community and collectivity for that artist and fan, because they want to be in that space with others. Sure, it's about, making money to survive, but there's also that like level of like emotional, like I'm trying to be within the community of artists here and I'm finding myself closed out. And so I definitely see that as a struggle that's maybe not going away for some while as furry grows and gets more competitive, but also, it's that question of how do we then like talk with conventions to have these conversations and think about, you know, how do we decide who gets in and also who gets left out, dependent upon like how many times they've been in a con space, for instance.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can't imagine if I were on the side of running a dealer's den and trying to choose who gets in and gets out in the most equitable way possible. I would not know how to do that. And I really think at this point it's like there's not enough tables in dealers' dens across all cons for all the artists who want that opportunity. And so like God, how do you deal with that? Because and I was laughing earlier because I'm like, even I have a list of cons that I'm just like, well, I don't feel welcome there because I've applied to their dealers then for the last, 5 or 6 years of them running as a con, and they just keep saying no. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, Robyn, have you struggled with that yourself as an artist, if I may ask?
I don't really like go for conventions or anything like that. And honestly, for me, the solution is like I think more small community driven spaces. I think DIY art marts, things like that. Obviously, it's easier in more urban areas, but even I was talking to some friends about like creating artist collectives. Like I know Demon Attack Zone is like a popular one right now. Like, just like
Uh,
doing stuff like that, getting on Neo Cities and things like that, and just supporting more people like that. Yeah.
good stuff.
So, so I don't know. That's kind of, where I feel.
Did you want to jump in on that point, Hazel, or do you think you're okay if I
I'm okay.
change topics?
Yeah,
Okay.
go for it.
So we talked a little bit about furry consumerism, capitalism, and we're coming up our time for questions and answers. But as trans queer furs, what are some issues maybe you see growing more and more within the fandom, but also if you can think back, maybe getting worse or kind of changing as we go into these like next several years? Do you feel that furry still has some room to grow? And if so, maybe what would you want to like bring into furry if you can usher something in to help kind of deal with the community at a way that builds it rather than like tries to restrict it? Because I feel like a lot of people they immediately go to that term of, oh, you're trying to control us, contain us in certain ways, when it's like, no, how do we make our community what we want it to be?
I think it's extremely hard to be a queer person of color in this fandom. Yeah, I think that that's like the number one like issue that we as a community face. I mean, the first time that I wore a fursuit, it was, kind of a jarring experience because it's like, you feel so elated to like have this extension of yourself and you can like express yourself in a way that, feels authentically you. But at the same time, people interact with you in an entirely different way. Like people wouldn't approach me the same way with brown skin, as opposed to having this on.
Yep.
And that is hurtful. And it's, conversations that a lot of people aren't equipped or ready to have. And a lot of non-POC furries also have the unfortunate tendency to compare the queer experience to the POC experience when those are two totally different things. And kind of checking people on that, having the ability to do that is something that a lot of people aren't equipped to do, or they get very defensive about it.
Yeah.
And like that is something that I think we desperately need to address as a community.
Yeah.
And I also want to add to that, like almost like I mean, it was in the chat too a little bit. I think one thing that I would like that I see continually that goes up and down with our political climate, but just like the idea of like, positivity, no politics in this community or these chats is like my number one biggest pet peeve because like for me, the political is inherently furry and furry is inherently political. And it's just like this thing where under these spaces where like when those admin rules are like you know uh prioritized, then we see this kind of like erasure of difference, erasure of like experiences, the kind of like acceptance of white supremacy, acceptance of these really terrible trends within our fandom thrive in spaces where no politics are allowed, if that makes sense. And like going
Yeah.
forward, if we're in this Trump administration, if we're in these kind of really harsh environments for queer and trans folks, especially queer and trans people of color, Furry, I think, has to address those things from an activist and political standpoint. And if we don't, we're not a community. we are just like, it's the unhealthy escapism versus an escapism that is for survival and trying to support one another, if that makes sense. And so I
Yeah.
think that's how we differentiate, but also that needs to change, and it hasn't changed. Even during the Black Lives Matter movement, it has helped, but like these things don't get prioritized still. Like it still get pushed down even today as like these things get more and more violent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's this question that I've been like sitting with where furry came in the late 20th century following so much political civil rights collectivity. And, simultaneous to furry's rise, you did see a depoliticization of queerness with gay and lesbian fitness magazines being taken up as this way of commoditizing the gay experience. And the name escapes me, but an author that I'm working with is thinking about how after the civil rights movement and this continued question of what Ronaldo Walcott calls the long emancipation, folks use the colorblind myth to kind of pull away from the harm of being implicated within a racial system and instead silencing it while walking under this kind of multicultural myth. And so furry, I think, is at this period where, we could argue this notion of animal difference and collectivity and multicultural worlds kind of brings in color blindness that then makes it possible for these discussions of race difference to get silenced and squashed as like we've already done that stuff. To go back to that issue, you're pulling out weeds that we don't necessarily need to talk about right now in the present. And it definitely is going to be a struggle as the chat's bringing up. It's this question of like, how do you have these talks without being willing to open up that emotional space with people for them to sit with and have those kind of contentions, not only with yourself, with themselves, but also with how they feel they're being viewed in certain ways.
I think it's just it should it's I'm struggling to find the words here, but
Yep.
it's like it should just, I feel like, be a common sense thing for people. Like, I
Mhm.
think back to 2020, I was living in Minneapolis when George Floyd was murdered.
Mhm.
I was boots on the ground the whole time that situation was happening. That was like one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. I watched my city literally burn to the ground. And 2 years later, I go to MFF when it, is back up, and I see, these furries in police uniforms hanging around a police car, like down in the rotunda, 2 states away from where all this shit went down. And I'm like, how do you not have, you know, the emotional intelligence, the political intelligence to, understand why this is strange to
Yep.
do in a predominantly queer fandom in, a city where it's predominantly people of color. Like, how does that not click for you instantly, you know? And that's just hard for me to grapple with as a person of color. I know that that's hard for a lot of people of color to grapple with because, bearing our hearts out, that's, we shouldn't have to do that, you
Right.
know? I tell people all the time Google is free, and I get met with, very middling responses of people being like, well, you should just tell me everything that you're feeling. And I'm like, I can't. If I did that for every single person all the time, no.
Right. And it's that like the real world bleeds into furry.
Mhm.
And people want to then say it's just fandom, it's just furry. And it's like, no, like these are
Yeah.
real issues that are coming into the community. You just want to like sidestep that to explain your bad behavior or unrecognition of another person's struggle.
Mhm.
But one of the questions that I think touches on this is in some ways as we shift into Q&A, um, in what ways maybe do we feel like technology has played a part in this? Kind of creating smaller in groups that can separate themselves from the wider community, or allowing this distancing effect from one another where someone could say, well, I'm doing my thing and that's kind of your issue. Do we feel technology has kind of played a part in that, or do you feel like this is a larger issue?
It could. I'm thinking about how the platforms that we're kind of, I guess at this point, forced to exist on online and online spaces can be very catered to your interests and not challenging to your worldview, and just create a little bit of like, wall yourself off from any outside perspective. And that can just reinforce whatever maybe toxic belief system you have. Um, that's it.
Yeah, does anybody else want to jump in on that, or do we feel, you know, technology is a medium, and so it kind of mediates tensions that are already going on in our daily lives?
I feel like it's not perfect, but it definitely help. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking about all these scenarios in my head, and I'm like, it's useful, but also it's awful, and it's just I don't know. Uh, Robin?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't jump
No,
spot.
I like I don't know. I think it's kind of like a beautiful thing that you can curate your space online, but yeah, it definitely, can lead to being kind of stuck in an echo chamber. Not everybody is gonna, seek those things that challenges them, which is where I think a lot of problems arise. So yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
there's much more to say about it than that.
Yeah. And then now turning to the chat, do we feel that being into the furry fandom inherently Therian or vice versa? Is there any separation between Therianthropy and furry? And we haven't touched on Therian. I think Therian is one of those, nebulas within furry that, you know, we can either have contact with in certain ways or, forget that it's there. But does anyone have any thoughts on Therian and furry, and maybe kind of like where we see it circulating?
Hey,
Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead, Will. Do you want to
oh,
address?
I'm here to get. I'm all I have to give is a human perspective. So if you
Okay.
if you have a theory perspective, please, by all means.
Yeah, well, I think like in my experience as like, like as they're not like as Darren, but like just like thinking about I don't think furry is inherently Therian because I think many Therians think of themselves as, I think they're not separate. I don't want to like put them in a binaristic like challenge, more of like there's potential overlap, but I think the Therian experience might be for at least some people very different from their furry experience, if that makes sense, Like I don't think of my I don't think of my persona as like like who I am at some points, but I feel like I'm like a wolf. It gets just different. Like it's just a for some reason in my brain it's different. I'm not going to compare it to, but it's like thinking about also my plurality and thinking about like how these things all furry supplements and furry supports these ways of thinking and knowing and experiencing the world around me in great ways, but I think they're differentiated experiences that furry just helps me kind of come to terms with or play with or experience with, if that makes sense. Is that useful?
Yeah, I think it is. I used to myself dabble within Therian, and trying to think about like, if I am a Therian, what does that look and feel like? And I think Therianism has a different wavelength or sense to it than furry. Whereas
Definitely.
furry, has this communal tie, the sense of production, queerness, exuberance. Therian can be many things, but I think it's this way of spiritually knowing oneself that we oftentimes forget when we are in these communal spaces. And so I I can't say whether or not furry is Therianism or Therianism is furry, but I think there is a wavelength difference that can bleed in one space and out and into the other. It's just dependent on the individual. And I can't say whether or not I've seen it in early furry, like in the fanzines and such, because that was a predominantly funny animal comic space. However, those questions did come up eventually, like in the 90s with TF fandom, and that question of becoming otherwise, that digital technology was allowing us to question in certain ways. One of the questions that did get up is, Um, let's see. How do we develop technological hygiene that allows us to keep interacting and communicating on the ground and challenge ourselves while staying safe? Does anybody want to jump in on that?
It's interesting because I've had really terrible experiences of figuring out what happens when you don't practice good online hygiene. I've had troubles with harassment and my home address and all sorts of things. Um, so all I can really give is like my personal tips for like what I've done to maintain my sanity with that. But as far as like how to maintain connection with your community, I think existing in a larger space with trepidation, um, with obscurity being the best sort of form of security, and then kind of moving into a smaller space from there into pockets that are a little more walled off is what has made sense to me. And then existing also in like when a physical space arises, whether it's a permanent or pop-up thing like a convention, that is like, okay, now this is another space to commune in, um outside of just like all of that, and to kind of just like, I guess, use it as a way to bridge the gap, to bridge these experiences where you get to actually really deeply connect with your community.
Yeah, Robyn or Hazel, do you want to jump in?
I think like yeah, the end goal should definitely be kind of, seeking to find physical spaces that like you can kind of have a nation. Um, like I think curating your space online again, like kind of going back to that and just like whittling down to like the people that you're like kind of in community with in a more specified way, you know, and just going from there. Like for me, it's like kind of diving into like the whole like internet ocean of artists, whittling that down, and now I have my local like furry Therian Beyblade group, which is like a weird specific thing, but like those are my people. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the questions that I think kind of ties into that is like, where are the rallying points as furry comes under attack from politicians, other groups, um, um, figures who want to harm queer youth? Like, um, where do we see ourselves rallying around? And I think Robyn, your touch on like these outer communities, kind of in conversation with furry,
yeah,
open space to think about that.
yeah, like I know like for our group like I joke that it's like Beyblade only, but like we've got like pretty robust mutual aid channels in there as well. And I think finding another group that's kind of tangential to us and sharing the data that we've collected with other groups and just being like, hey, here's all the Philly resources that we have. What Philly resources do you have? How can we rally together, make sure that everybody is getting their hormones, being able to get laser, medical treatment, all these things. Like we can just compile all of that together, work together as artists. I think that's critical. Yeah.
Hazel, Willow, anyone else? Okay. Now, as we wrap up, we have one question that asks, as far as furry being able to acknowledge political questions, what have you seen that is encouraging? For example, POC centered events, et cetera. How much impact have you seen? And I think we can broaden that. Like, what are things within furry that are encouraging, are hopeful, allow us to see, that as much as we do want to contend with fandom and its limitations and effects from outside structures, what are the things that you are really excited or passionate about within the community?
I think just the first thing that came to mind when, if we're talking about how to utilize, this greater furry community for, let's get us involved more in politics and organizing, that I've literally seen panels, I think it was at this past FC, about literally like how to organize, how to put that sort of community together and what you can do with it. That's been like, that was a very just like refreshing thing to see from the fandom, because it's that sort of apolitical attitude of like, oh, I'm just a dog or whatever is, great for the escapism. But I feel like politically, maybe we've reached a point where we should utilize the size and strength of the community to do something with it. And that's like, oh, well, that's a great start. I think that, yeah, it was, I think, stigmatas in the chat there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Hazel.
Yeah, just anything like I mean, I know you asked about like what in the community, but almost like I think about it, like I will see more and more like furries, like like seeing all like clock furries in like my activist spaces because they are doing the work, like anarchists who are furries who are doing the work in the community already. Like I feel like I'm excited to see furries out and about like at schools, at colleges, universities, in activist spaces, at places where people are fighting about or like talking about Palestine, like those things intersecting, like
Yeah.
for identity, for experiences, and like having these things be political, or like what I'm excited to see is that furries aren't just, in their spaces, they're also out making changes and trying to do that work in the community. So I'm excited to see that more and more, and I see people doing that as, again, we're in this administration that is doing so much harm for us, and I can see it targeting furry in the future.
Yeah.
Did you want to jump in, Robyn? Or
No,
all right.
I don't really have anything new to add.
I think for me to coincide with all the points, this question of like how fans more and more can learn more of their history, but not just like furry history, but also like those histories that we think don't fall into that term or idea of fandom. Fandom is queerer, I always want to argue, than we think of it. And so like one of the things that I always sit with, and I'm currently working on a paper on, is like, how does the Black radical tradition sit within furry through Albert Temple, Shantae Howard, Ken Sample? How do questions of capitalism come up in furry, as we've discussed already? And if we kind of see furry as this way of thinking about history, how and in what ways can we then extend or continue these genealogies that are important or crucial to us? So, if furries started their own publications in order to distribute work, are there any ways in which, we can continue that going? And then I remember I went to a queer history conference and a scholar had asked us on the panel, in what ways do you see the digital affecting distribution? And I had argued, like, I get handed zines at FurCons all the time. And so I don't think the digital has affected more material distribution. It's just opened up more possibility for people to get their work out there. And I think, the material and paper and historical can still exist simultaneous to the digital. And so I would really love to see, more panels, just the same as like mutual care, mutual aid coming up, but panels talking about furry history, but also other historical movements that have happened outside the community we like to think as separate from us. We are out of time here, but I want to thank everyone for being here and asking wonderful questions. And I want to thank my lovely panelists for joining in on this conversation. I know, when we think of time and history, it gets a little heavy, but I think as Robyn pointed out, there is hope within these conversations. There are new futures being written as we're thinking about these things. So with that said, I want to thank you all for coming again. Stay safe out there, stay well, and I look forward to further conversations coming out from all of you and the future of your work, particularly.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Quick throw out. Where can we reach you if we wanted to see your work, Robyn, Hazel, and Willow? So let's start with Robyn. Where can we see your work if you're sharing it or have it available?
I'm on Blue Sky and Instagram and soon NeoCities. You can find me anywhere under TaciturnDeer.
And then Hazel?
I have a website for my academic work and publications on furry. I'm just going to put it in the chat. It's hzaman.net.
And then Willow?
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky for Affinity and Patreon. And if you want to find my little website where you can find all of my platforms, it's just glopossum.com, GLO possum.
And then for my information, you can actually find me at Deep Space Swine, one word, bluesky.social. I post there pretty frequently, though I do have a Twitter account, Princess of Party. Again, thank you all for this great conversation. It was lovely to see you all and talk with you on the fandom we love so much. Have a good rest of your weekend and stay safe
Thank
out
you,
there.
Brandy. Thank you.